welcome to our interview series on Technology Impact Assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a visiting scientist at Arizona State University these days, and I'm also a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute in Australia. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and has been ongoing since November 2024. In this series, we're focusing on technology impact assessment for peace and stability, and today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Steve Wilson. Hello.
Hi, Katina. It's great to see you. Thanks for the invitation to be involved with this.
Thank you so much. We've had a relationship, I think, through our research and academic work for decades, I can say now. But formally, I can introduce you as a researcher, an innovator, and analyst in data protection specifically. You deal with everything data, but very interestingly as well with identity, digital identity, that is. And you've been a lead digital identity advisor for so many governments in the world. I'm going to name Australia, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Macau, New Zealand, and Singapore, among many others, awarded many patents. You have been a researcher in universities, and you can tell us more about that in a moment when I give you a chance. But you were described by digital ethnographer Trisha Wang as one of the most original thinkers in digital identity in the world today. And I have to say, given your work in public key infrastructure since the mid-90s, you're one of Australia's leading, if not internationally leading, digital credential specialists. And it gives me just great pleasure to be talking about emerging technologies with you in technology impact assessment.
Well, that introduction was pretty complete. Thank you very much. Yeah, all I can do is traverse all of that again, but I think I should say a few things about digital identity and the intersection with data and data protection. But I do also want to say, because it's not on the recording, but we were just chatting with my wife, Elizabeth Denny Wilson, who's a professor at Sydney Uni in public health research and professor of nursing. But she's taught me a lot about behaviour change over the years. And, she deals with obesity and public health issues where, from the engineering perspective, people make notoriously bad decisions all of their lives and wind up in suffering consequences, and society suffers consequences. And this actually goes straight to technology impact as well. But why did you click on that link? And why is your password so stupid? And why don't you change your password every 30 days? And there's so much victim blaming going on in cybersecurity. At every level, it's really deeply systemic that engineers have no sympathy for people making bad decisions. But people smoke and they eat too much and they don't exercise. And my wife has taught me, maybe 50 years ago, public health people stopped blaming people for making stupid decisions. That's not even part of their frame. They don't think about decisions being stupid. They just think about humans doing what humans do. They gamble. And that's kind of really important to me. And there's a bunch of sort of epidemiological principles that I think over the next 10 years we might see integrated into cyber. But yeah. I think that a lot of what we might deal with in security and privacy has got to do with behaviour change and understanding behaviour change impact. The other thing, of course, that, there's always that famous experiment where a privacy person will stop people in the street and offer them a Mars bar or $10 for their passwords, and they give up their passwords. And then privacy people say, why do you spend so much time on Facebook? Don't you know what's happening with your data? And of course, people have got no bloody idea what's happening with their data. And people have got no real idea about the impact of, fat on their bloodstreams so, we set people up to fail in cyber. We have these notoriously complicated systems that are not designed for human beings, and they're brittle. It doesn't take much to sort of crash software. So we set people up to fail, and oh my God, there's just so much to learn from public health, I think. Anyway.
I think that's a wonderful precursor, Stephen, because when we talk about technology impact assessment and assessments being accessible to the general public so they can be so we
Uh-huh.
can raise more awareness, or they could be more educated on a particular topic, or really start to um, think about future implications. Often these technology assessments are for corporations or government regulators. They're not so much for the general public. And so I
Mm.
think these insights that you offer us are really critical, especially when we're talking about what have been so named critical emerging technologies. But if we just use this as a backdrop, because I love where we've begun, um, tell us briefly about Lockstep Consulting.
Okay, it's a small company based in Sydney. It's we're 21 years old now. I tend to say we because I actually do think about the business as being a corporate entity, but it is mostly a sole practice. What I like to say about Lockstep is that it does a lot of self-funded research. In some ways, I'm a bit of an academic without portfolio. We
Mm,
have published as much as I can over the years in a few peer-reviewed spots, but also a lot of just self-published articles in trade magazines and on my website. Um, it started because I was very keen to see identity technologies. So this is going back 20 years ago. Uh, I think that in the 1990s, some of us started to see that identity technologies were problematic from several perspectives. One was that they were just overblown. There was a very singular, I've been trying to find the right word for this, but a very singular presumption about identity that there is a human identity, there's a human user.
mm,
And identity people in the 90s, so in public key infrastructure with digital certificates, we started being quite um, smart about being able to separate people's roles and attributes. And, there's role-based access control, there are attribute certificates. The idea was that you would authenticate somebody and then you would authorize them as a second step to participate in different activities. We even started talking about different digital personae and different digital walks of life. Uh, but somehow at the bottom of it, there was still the thought that there was a core identity. So there's all this language around core identity, passport.
mm,
Um, there's a strict in cybersecurity. There's a strict separation of authentication, which is who you are. Authorization is what you're allowed to do. And about 20 years ago, I started thinking that that was leading to some poor outcomes. And in particular, public key infrastructure had a whole lot of unsung benefits for what we now call verifiable credentials. So there is a way easy to issue a digital certificate to an individual, put it under their control with a private key in a phone, as it turns out now.
mm-hmm,
Very, very easy to bind a certificate to an individual in control of a key. And in that certificate, there's just an assertion about some fact that matters. So you could equip an individual with the ability to carry a certified fact about themselves and present that fact digitally signed, so it's cryptographically challengeable and verifiable to prove something about yourself. For example, maybe you want to prove that you're over 18. Canonical use case these days. And, 20 plus years ago, it was pretty obvious to me that you could bind that public key certificate to, I was going to use smart cards at the time, but now it's all mobile phones.
yeah.
So I set up Lockstep to do a few things. We got some patents commercialized, did some prototyping with the US government. Um, and that was the core of Lockstep. And then it became um, kind of a melting pot of ideas for me. I'm just so lucky to be able to generate some income from consulting and and then do this self-funded research and maybe too much research from time to time. Um, I started to think bigger about data protection, and it's an interesting word. I still don't think it's the right word for what
Mm,
we want to talk about. But, I start from the fact that in Europe, data protection is essentially synonymous with data privacy. So in Australia, we have the Privacy Act and we do privacy impact assessments. And in Europe and many places, they have data protection acts and data protection regulators and data protection impact assessments. Um, so I started from that idea that data protection and privacy, let's say at this stage, they're synonymous. Then you've got cyber security, which is about confidentiality, integrity, availability. the way that we do impact assessments in cyber is that you take a data record, you think about its importance on three dimensions: confidentiality, integrity, availability. You treat those attributes as valuable and things that
Hmm.
need to be protected or analysed in terms of what could go wrong. So a classic cyber risk assessment will take a set of records, say electronic health records or maybe voting, and say, what's the confidentiality, integrity, availability of that information asset? What could go wrong to harm any of those three dimensions? And then what countermeasures do you put in place to protect against foreseeable harm? So that's the kind of cut and dried threat risk assessment. And I started thinking, well, privacy, the orthodox approach to privacy is to look at, pick your regime, um, 13 Australian privacy principles. What is it in GDPR? 7, I think, GDPR principles. In America, you could pick the 10 fair information practice principles, 10 FIPS. So you pick 10 of them. Um, you think that those are the 10 things that matter, or 13 things or 7 things that matter about your records. And then you look at what your system does to protect those 7 or 10 or 13 principles. And then you document it, and you study it, and you come up with recommendations that are kind of similar to the cyber threat risk assessment.
Hmm.
Um, so I started thinking, why don't we put these things together? And it requires a bit of a change of mindset because threat risk assessment is about what can go wrong, usually attackers or human error or random error. At least in Australia, the classic PIA, privacy impact assessment, is actually studying the system as designed and what harms can occur in privacy as designed. And that's really quite different from, because the default assumption is that information will harm privacy or information systems will harm privacy, which is an interesting sort of default assumption. I don't think it's wrong. Um, Cyber security, on the other hand, looks at things that are presumed to go wrong through adverse events. That's the
Hmm.
language of it. Um, in privacy, the adverse event is the information system. The adverse event is the electronic health record. So cyber is different. So I don't know. I'm only just articulating this for the first time. Maybe cyber is intrinsically optimistic, and privacy is intrinsically pessimistic in the way it frames these orthodox risk assessments. Be that as it may, the most important thing I've thought about in the last 5 years is that if data is some sort of important asset, um, what makes it valuable? And can we protect the different facets of that? So I think data protection or information protection, um, we could think bigger about that. Um, and certainly the privacy impact assessment is about things that can go wrong and how do you protect against that. I think that we could invert that and start thinking about information as an asset. What's good about it? What is valuable about it? And if we do that transparency, then we can also maybe navigate the really terrible questions of monetizing data and
Hmm.
exploiting data behind people's backs. Um, I this is like the third rail of privacy, but I think that there are ways to monetize data in a respectful way and in a positive way. And I do not buy into people should own their data and they should buy it and sell it.
Hmm.
Because I think that that will set people up to fail in a horrible way. It would be like there is a thought that people should be participating in clinical trials and selling their bodies in a sense and profiting
Yes.
from that. And I get it. I think reasonable people might have different views of that, but you'd surely be setting people up to fail. Vulnerable people would be. So I do not subscribe to the idea that I should own my records and I should sell. I do, however, think that data quality is valuable, and I think, and Lockstep has done a huge amount of work. I'll sort of declare this on what we call a data verification platform, which is a well-articulated architecture for distributing the metadata signals that people could use to tell if a record is valuable or not. Now, that value is in the eye of the beholder. Um, a clinical researcher is going to want to get their hands on data that is um, peer reviewed and it's come from real life patients. It's not synthetic data, it's real data. It's been collected through a trial. It's been collected by calibrated medical equipment. It's been collected with consent. So one of the most
Hmm.
important attributes of clinical trial data is consent. Um, there'll be other people who have different senses of what data means to them. So look, I'm rabbiting on a lot here, but I want to get quickly to the point that any particular record is valuable to people in a way that can be protected. And the attributes of that data that make it valuable, if you've got reliable attributes, I think people would pay for that. And we know
Hmm.
that people do. There are business models where you buy, if you're a business person, you buy subscriptions to the big data brokers, because you know that information that's come from Dun and Bradstreet is probably better than the information that you might just find by Googling it. So people pay a premium for that. I think that if you do this properly, then you could distribute metadata signals and charge fees for it, just like we distribute credit card numbers over credit card networks. All those things do. They've got one job, which is to distribute the 16-digit numbers on your credit cards. And they distribute them around the world, and merchants pay a bit of money for that. And ultimately, we all pay a few percent for our credit card transactions.
Yes.
And we do that more or less voluntarily because it's better data. And if that data is stolen and abused behind my back, the banks will compensate me. So there are all
Hmm.
sorts of ways of doing this in a in a fair way. It's very early days when it comes to data, but wow, Katina, you might have to edit that back because it was a long spiel
No,
about what I
it's
do.
beautiful. One of the things I found interesting about your bio actually is that you said digital identity boils down to data. In fact, many aspects of our processes today in the world boil back down to data and good data, and you're talking about data quality that has been collected with informed consent. And two areas we've spoken about on the grant have been digital identity and cybersecurity. And we look at it from the perspective of a joint impact assessment between Australia and India. And of course, India's very well known inroads into biometrics and digital identity. I'm sure you've got some thoughts and reflections on India's approach and then Australia's approach. Can you set us up with a sort of a backdrop, a quick backdrop of how does Australia deal with digital identity broadly and
Hmm.
cybersecurity, and perhaps the same for India?
Um, there are five major countries in the world that have, um, I, it would be fascinating to understand why they are all the same.
Hmm.
There are five countries that have no national ID, for one thing. They all made a strategic decision at government level 20 something years ago to not legislate for digital identity. It was a big emerging question in the late 1990s,
Mm,
how to deal with identification online. And these five countries decided not to legislate. And they all issued policy directives saying that we think that this type of thing, meaning digital identity solutions, is amenable to market forces, and we'll let the markets come up with solutions. There's several other common things about these countries. They all cooperate in signals security, and they all happen to be common law system countries, and they are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United Kingdom, and the United States. Um, the Five Eyes, and I try not to call them the Five Eyes because I think the interesting question is that the sociological or social sciences question is that they're all common law system countries, and I think that that's what unites us. And it's given us this allergy. Those five countries have got an allergy to national identity. Um, and meanwhile, the posted children cases for digital identity around the world are countries like India and Singapore and Estonia. Those are not common law system countries. Their relationship between the populace and the government are distinctly different to the other thing about the five countries is they're all Anglophone countries. They're the major English-speaking countries. So it's all my instinct is that this is not a tech or a defense alliance
mm,
commonality. I think there's something deeper than that. Anyway, famously, where digital identity has worked around the world, and we can argue what work means, but the most effective digital identity systems are always based on national identity systems. So Now, India is a special case. I'll come back to it. But clearly, in Europe and Singapore and Estonia, those those states, those governments are more or less comfortable with having national ID. And so you digitize it and you wind up with digital identity. Now, that easy, join the dots, very easy line from national identity to digital identity has been the bugbear of the digital identity industry for many, many years because most digital identity professionals don't take a position on national ID. They don't care, or they tend left and they'll say, we would like to not have digital national identity. Most lay people or business people, when they think about this, they will pretty quickly, you can sense that they are drifting to a default assumption that what we're talking about in digital identity is a national identity. Now, Australia has had this belief in a private sector led digital identity marketplace for 20 years. We have tried to foster that with different programs like trust frameworks. All
Hmm.
five Anglophone countries have all spent a lot of money on what they call trust frameworks. I put that in shutter quotes because I think it's a horrible idea that a bunch of governance systems and largely IT audits would deliver digital tokens that in turn deliver trust. And I've been having an argument on LinkedIn, you might have noticed, Katina, over the last couple of weeks about a particular statement about a business that sells systems or solutions so that people can trust each other. And I think our industry has gone completely nuts about the word trust. Like um, in particular, proof of age. This business sells proof of age technology so that people who buy liquor or whatever can carry a digital token backed by the government. And it's all very respectable and it's very careful and it's a good product. I love it. It's a really important product, but it's got nothing to do with trust. It's the exact opposite of trust because the person who's trying to buy liquor and prove that they're over 18, the merchant doesn't want to trust the person that they're over
Yes.
18. The merchant wants to know that the person is over 18. So says a third party. And in fact, when you think about it, when the government mandates in the UK, the government has mandated proof of age for selling adult services. The government, by mandating it, the government is saying to merchants, you must not trust the shopper.
Yes.
You must get independent, certified, blah, 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 blah,
Hmm.
legislatively backed proof of age so that you do not trust the customer. And it sounds a bit clinical and a bit reductionist, but um, I love that old Italian proverb that it's nice to trust, but it's better not to. And I think if you look at governance, and I'm sorry if this sort of collides with any of the buzzwords or the keywords in your grant, but if you look at governance, it's about not trusting people. And that's not a
Hmm.
bad thing. It sounds clinical and terrible, but it's not a bad thing. So much in society is about, so much of civilization and social order is about not having to trust people. Um, so,
So,
um,
so could we go on that thread and now link it to peace and stability and the importance of
yeah,
perhaps jointly looking at
yeah.
assessing technologies in the digital identity slash cybersecurity spaces between Australia and India, for
Yeah, I
example?
think so. A lot of what I talk about digital identity being nothing more than data and metadata, and that sounds clinical and reductionist. And a lot of my hippie friends, they lose it at that point. But
Mm.
I think this is a good thing because some of the consequences or some of the results of my thinking is that um, when it comes to designing a system, and that could be a government system or a tech system, when it comes down to designing a system where you're anticipating the needs of, famously Alice and Bob, the two kind of classic participants in a system, if you allow Alice and Bob to use technology to get on and get something done together, you've got to ask yourself, what does Alice and Bob need to know about each other in order to achieve their outcomes? And that's usually often we intuitively think Alice and Bob are two people that have met at the pub, um, and they're equals, but they're usually not. This is
Mm,
usually an asymmetric relationship. Now, it can be
that's right.
asymmetric in power. or not. But the main thing is that Alice needs to know different things about Bob from what Bob needs to know about Alice. And that asymmetry, when it comes to design, is really important. Lots and lots of schools of thought in digital identity trace back to what used to be called the web of trust, and where Alice and Bob would be proud owners of their own roll your own encryption software, and they'd have private keys, and they would come together and they would exchange their public keys in a key exchange ceremony. You remember this?
Yeah, of course.
Some of us do. That
Definitely.
default model that Alice and Bob appears and they're going to exchange public keys that have um, equal standing, that's really wrong. The real scenario is somewhat more complicated where Alice needs to know something about Bob. Bob needs to know something different about Alice.
Hmm.
Now, now, my reductionist sort of view of this, it's all data. It's not reductionist. I'm trying to be precise about designing systems so that Alice can get to know stuff about Bob and vice versa. So when you design these systems, you have to think, what does Alice need to know? Where is she going to get the information from?
Hmm.
And thirdly, how is she going to know if the information is true or true enough or fit for purpose is the best way to look at it. And so there's plenty of examples, but we could do age again. Like if Alice is trying to sell liquor to Bob, she wants to know if Bob is over 18 or 21 or whatever the rules are. Where are you going to get that information from? Well, you're not going to get it from Bob. Um, you're told
Hmm.
not to. So you're going to get it from classically a, um, a government authority. How are you going to get the information? You're going to get it usually on the back of a driver's license. Now, how do you know if it's true? Well, physically, you can see if the driver's license is genuine or not. You can look for the holograms and the things. You know, it's fascinating human interaction. Humans can validate driver's licenses from any country in the world without having any knowledge, without even being able to speak the language. A bar person can take a Thai or a Filipino
Hmm.
driver's license and know that it's real, know it's well enough.
Yes.
And this is really fascinating because there's a grammar in driver's licenses that's almost universal.
Hmm.
You can pick the date of birth even in a foreign language. And then how do you know if it's true? Well, I have no idea about the Filipino Driver's License Authority, no idea whatsoever. But if I'm a bar person,
Mm.
I can see a hologram. It feels like a national driver's license. You know, those are all the cues that are good enough. Try and do that with AI. This is where AI driver's licenses or even just digital driver's licenses for renting cars is going to be really difficult because the software has got none of the human ability to read. Anyway, um, so the questions that we should be asking around peace and stability when it comes to technology is um, how many existing um, frameworks or cues or conventions that we use for stability in the real world, how do we carry these in my world digitally? I
Hmm.
guess that your terms of reference are broader than just the internet and digital, but that's my drive. Um, how do you do this? I call it the analog to digital conversion. How do you take all of these analog things that we're familiar with and codify them digitally? And it has to come down to data. So this is a matter of precision and engineering. If you're building IT systems, data is all you got,
Hmm.
and metadata. So you and I are conversing over a beautiful video channel, and I know what you look like, and vice versa. But
Mm.
it's just data. The other reason why remembering that it's just data is going to be the best defense we've got over the next 5 years against deep fakes.
That's right.
If people don't really understand that this is just data, and some of the data is true and some of the data is not, if people don't understand that all we got is data, then they're not going to be able to deal with the necessary countermeasures for deep fakes.
I think
Um,
that's correct. I mean, ontologies, for example, how do we know what's on a driver's license card? It's standardized. It's ontological meaning. What a DOB. We know what that is, but as you say, you know, people are trying to find human mechanisms by which to prove their identity when they are just receiving data. I mean, you're coming through a channel to me. Let's just say you're data and you're some, you know, uh, deep fake. The way to introduce this, either turn the head so we can see if there are any glitches, or give me a secret passcode that you and I have decided offline in person, and then I know it's really you because, the chances of anyone knowing that passcode would be Buckley's.
Manageably low.
Yes, so we're getting to something really important here, and definitely cyber is a big part of our research on peace and stability, and the need for countries to actually talk to one another about digital identity, about data sharing, about data protection, about cybersecurity, and the massive AI enabled attacks that are already hitting us. Arguably, some may say it's not happening, most will say it is. We've gone beyond the nascent stages of how we can use Gen AI for cybersecurity attacks. But
Mm.
let's go back to what you started with regards to life cycles of technology, or uh, where we come on board when we're doing a privacy impact assessment. Is it too late after the fact? Do you
Mm.
advocate, as someone who has these patents and someone who has worked in the digital ID space, that the time to start these assessments is at the very beginning?
Yeah. Yeah. I was consulting to a team once at the early stage of doing a PIA for a government, and the team was a bit impatient. They had better things to do than to talk to a consultant, and they said, mate, why are we doing a PIA? We haven't even started design yet. And I said, we're going to do a PIA because you haven't started design yet. It's the right time to do it, to evaluate some options. So actually, that was engaging, and the people got it. The people concerned. So yeah, early, do PIAs early and often. Obviously, they cost money. So, but I think two PIAs is always a good idea for complicated system. It is good to do a PIA on release to make sure that it's legally compliant. But yeah, you should do things early, and you should. That's the other thing about privacy policy, if I could say. I use privacy policy as a design tool as well, because I think when it comes down to it, a privacy policy should be um, a statement about what personal information do I hold about you? Why have I got that personal information? Where did I get it? Have I told you, the subject, that I've got information about you? Where did I get it? How did I get it? What am I doing with it? Um, where's it going to go? So it's like who, why, where, how, what. Now, you can start asking those questions at the very early stages of design. So, we were doing a lot of this during the COVID pandemic with Service New South Wales, which was a very proactive
Yes, they
privacy
were.
organisation. Yeah, so we were very early on saying, what information do we have? Well, we want to know about people's COVID. We want to know about people's check-ins at restaurants.
Hmm.
And why do we want that? Well, we want it for contact tracing, and then you can follow that line down. In Australia, thanks to contact tracing, we've been doing contact tracing for 50 years on paper for influenza and food
Exactly.
poisoning and sexually transmitted diseases. COVID comes along. At one level, it was just another infectious notifiable disease. If you catch a notifiable disease, your healthcare professionals are legally obligated to tell the government about it. So it's part of the social contract that's a good thing. COVID comes along. Um, so why have you got that information? Where did you get it? Well, we could get it from databases or from retail systems, but we thought, no, that's overreach and too complicated. So where do we get it? Let's get it through QR codes and self-check-in, because there's a ceremony, and the assumption is that if people are using a QR code to check in to a cafe, then they are actively consenting to sharing their location, etc., etc. So if you're writing a privacy policy that says, what information have we got? Why have we got it? Where did we get it?
Hmm.
How did we get it? What are we going to do with it? That's just one sentence each at design time, and engineers can, programmers and software people can use that as a framework within which they can do good design, and also um, iterate that several times, and then you get a real privacy policy that's not just Steve Wilson's 6 sort of dot points, but something that you could then feed to the lawyers and say, look, please write a legally valid privacy policy. So I think that sort of design thinking for information collection and privacy policies related to your question about when should you do privacy impact assessment, you should do privacy thinking, from the outset. And I also like to say that privacy is like an outcome. I like the term privacy engineering, but that's really engineering for a privacy outcome.
Yes.
Um, Funny thing about privacy is that it's mostly determined by what you do with data. And to protect privacy, it's what you don't do with data.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's about restraint. And if you can, I guess, train engineers early on to think about privacy in that way, then it's what you choose not to do with data that delivers better privacy outcomes.
Stephen, my last question as we're running out of time is doing this at scale. So I love your comments about uh, the need for early intervention with impact assessments of all types. But
Mm.
let's say we were doing this at scale for government, between governments, so in a bilateral or future multilateral capacity. Let's say it was the Five Eyes nations working together on a digital credential system or digital ID system, or let's say it was Five Eyes working together on cybersecurity, or in this instance, as we're researching Australia and India. Have you worked in international teams on projects where you've had to compare notes and do things together? And what are briefly, some of the outcomes of that kind of work?
Um, Gosh, yes, going back, some of the early APEC work and EASEAN work that I was involved with, the answer is yes. It was not structured around, certainly not structured around technology impact assessment or even privacy impact assessment. But with my experience since then, the way that I would think about the problem again comes down to the design thinking orientation, which is what do you need to know about a counterparty and where you're going to get that information. That orientation could be the way to break through what appears to be an impasse between a country with national ID and a country with no national ID and a different civic administration. So
Mm,
we wind up in different places in the digital realms. India has its national ID card, Aadhaar. I mentioned before that the best or the most successful digital systems are built on national ID systems. In India, the perspective was that they had a greenfield. They wanted
mm-hmm,
to introduce a new civic administration at the same time as being digital. So the mindset was certainly it'll be part of the social contract or social arrangement to have national ID. Um, it might seem as though the Indian system and Australia are incompatible, and you don't want to get into questions about the strength of an Indian ID and the strength of a de facto Australian passport or whatever we've got. You don't want to go there because those systems are fit for purpose within their own contexts. They're not designed to. So I think ironically, the thing about a national ID is that it's used in the digital area. It's only used as metadata. The thing I said before, what do you need to know about somebody? Where are you going to get the data from? How do you know that the data is fit for purpose? That's where national ID is a useful tool because if everybody's got one, and if it's used as the anchor for a digital wallet, for example, then what it's doing is underpinning the validity of the attributes that are in that wallet. So, the Australian asking for an attribute from an Indian, um, and then asking programmatically, like in software, how do I know if that attribute is true? The national ID, the Aadhaar system of India is like an underpinning that produces metadata and support for the accuracy of attributes, for example.
mm-hmm,
But in Australia, going the other way, it's going to be a different sort of system and a more of a laissez-faire sort of system that generates digital wallets in Australia and underpins that. But yeah, that's how I would start with it. I would be really interested in the Aadhaar system as a system of signals
mm-hmm.
that are helping people understand the story behind any piece of data that you're trying to work with. I know that we're flat out of time, and we're there's a lot to explore around technology impact and so on, but
I think you've given us some wonderful insights based on your prime expertise, Stephen, and um, who knows if there'll be a part two to this conversation where we explore further the specifics around technology life cycles, and technology impact assessment. But I think it's been wonderful to gain this perspective on two areas in particular that we're looking into, digital ID and cybersecurity, and this notion of what is a critical emerging technology. I think you've really brought us the message that it's all underpinned by good data. And we're only as good as our data, and data quality is important, so is informed consent, but also around when do we begin these impact assessments. And I know I can speak on behalf of many people who have known of your work in Lockstep Consulting and beyond with governments and so forth, that you're a wonderful advisor that is still in the space, working very hard. Um, so all I'm going to say is a big thank you as I prepare for the next interview, and thank you for your thoughts and
uh,
reflections and time.
a great pleasure, Katina. The questions are so good, and I always learn so much from every interaction that we have. I wish it was more often. So
Thank you so much,
thanks for having
Steve.
me as part of this.
Thank you so much for your time again.
Good luck with the work.